Today I'm going to be talking about the suicide epidemic in Utah, just because I feel like it's a really important subject that we should all be knowledgeable and aware of, and something that I feel like everyone can do their part to make a difference in your own community and in your families and in your own self. So suicide in Utah is something that I feel like is pretty often talked about. Utah is actually the 5th leading state in suicide. In 2015, there were 630 deaths committed by suicide. This doesn't count all the number that of the people that died, or that attempted suicide and did not die. They say only about 1 in every 25 attempts actually ends up dying from suicide. So times 630 by 25, and that's about how many people attempted suicide in the year of 2015 in Utah alone. It's a number one leading cause for ages 10 to 24 in Utah, as well as the second leading cause for ages 25 to 44 in Utah. You can see that the graph over here shows this first line is the Utah males throughout the past 16 years. And then the orange line is the U.S. males. And then you can see that the yellow is the Utah females, where the purple is the U.S. female average. So in comparison, Utah has got a lot of work to do, and something that we can all really pitch in to overcome and to make a difference. First, it's important to know what the risk factors are of suicide if we're going to have any changes whatsoever. So a lot of things that put you at risk to be more suicidal or have a higher chance of committing suicide are things like a psychiatric diagnosis. This would be something like being bipolar or depressed, or different mental illnesses like that. Another thing that they say is hopelessness, aggressive behavior, so a lot of spontaneous aggressive behavior too, or that a person has become aggressive and never was aggressive before. It's also a risk factor. And social isolation. You can almost link every single suicide case back to somebody socially isolating themselves, whether they quit a dance team, pulled back from taking classes that they loved at school, wouldn't hang out with their friends anymore, different things like that. Now, social isolation, you have to be kind of careful because anyone can take a step back from life, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're all of a sudden suicidal. However, in a big way that would really start to affect their personality, that's what the risk factor is that we're talking about in this case. So things like that are the risk factors, which again are important to know, because if we can find the risk factors, we can be able to search for those in those that we love and care for, and even those that we just interact with on a day-to-day basis. So warning signs. What do you do if you think somebody is suicidal, or what kind of questions can you ask yourself? There are a few good questions that through research and different studies that I have found that they've said are most effective when you ask yourselves these questions about if somebody is suicidal or not. So questions like, do they have a change in their daily routine? Again, kind of going back to that social isolation. Have they really changed something that they were really doing day to day? Are they talking of suicide? That's the biggest one, the most obvious one. And usually a suicidal person may not talk about it so much, especially if it's more of a spontaneous activity. But another thing to think about, are they saying goodbye to everybody, or giving things away, or writing notes that they generally wouldn't, that have more of a sense of parting? Are they trying to obtain lethal weapons or drugs? That might not be as easy to know about, but definitely something that would be a warning sign. Do they talk about being a burden, or do they talk about that they can't go on because they are a disappointment to so-and-so, or they only make so-and-so's life worse. Do they say that there's no hope for them in the future, or talk about how they don't see a future in their life, or they won't be successful, or things like that? Are they participating in destructive behavior? This is to themselves and those around them. So maybe reckless driving, cutting, bruising, doing activities that have a high death toll with them when they normally wouldn't, things like that. However, specifically looking at Utah, there are a few things that we need to consider that do make Utah more at a higher risk of that suicide rate. Some of these things we can control, and some of these things we really just can't control. And it's been interesting to find that in the research that I've been doing. The geography of Utah is something that's kind of brought up a little bit when you hear about doctors talking about suicide, but what about just the general public? Not so much. It's actually, as you can see, kind of this picture shows that we have quite a mountainous range, which means two things. It's easier for pollution to kind of stay in the valleys that we have, and our elevation is much higher than other states. This is important for a few different things. The elevation makes it so you're not getting as much oxygen into your lungs. This means that the less oxygen into your lungs, the less oxygen into your brain, which decreases your soporium drug that's in your brain, but increases your dopamine. This effect automatically causes depression. And there's actually a DNA study going on that some people are genetically more inclined to go more depressed when that off-balance happens. Now they say that a lot of Utah transplants, or people that haven't grown up in Utah, are more susceptible to this because they haven't ever experienced that much of an imbalance in their brain. So therefore they're going to struggle more with the elevation, which would be a harmful thing, could be a very harmful thing to them. There's also SAD, which is a seasonal depression, and those happen on times where we go longer without the sun being as close to us. So our winter times, you'll find that suicide spikes during the winter time. They attribute that to not being able to get as much sunlight, which causes a depression, which then can lead to different thoughts and suicidal actions. It's also interesting to find that pollution makes a difference as well. Like I said, we're in a place where the pollution kind of gets stuck in our valleys. It's talked about time and time again of how it's unhealthy for us to breathe and things like that, but have we ever considered that it's also unhealthy in the way that it could lead to suicide? There's actually multiple studies going on right now about it. The pollution has little tiny particles of nitrogen and carbon dioxide and things like that. And at times during the year, those particles are bigger when the pollution is staying in the valleys. That, again, if we go back to the elevation, makes it so we can't breathe as well. And when we can't breathe as well, it sets off that chemical imbalance. And then we can go forward with the same assumptions as elevation. But even those particles of pollution will trigger that. And so whether you're born in Utah or not, your lungs aren't ready for that pollution or to kind of take in those particles and break them down. It's not a natural thing. It's not natural air. And so it could be another reason that why Utah has such a higher rate than some other states like California or states that are lower to the ocean or have much cleaner air, different things like that. The next thing is the possession of lethal substances. Over 43% of households in Utah have a gun inside the home. Now, does this mean that anyone with a gun is going to end up committing suicide? No. However, Utah is ranked one of the highest in how many guns per home, and I found through research that those states that have that higher percentage are more so in the top 10 of suicide rates in the United States. We're also one of the highest states for misuse in prescription drugs, especially in stay-at-home mothers. If you drive down I-15 through Utah right now, you'll notice that you can hardly go 15 minutes without seeing a billboard of Stop the Epidemic, which is talking about opiates and how they're being misused and how they lead to overdoses or things like that. It's proven that, again, if we see this, males use firearms. However, the top reason or cause of suicide or what they do to kill themselves for females is poisoned by drugs. And so that would again directly link to why females in Utah tend to have that higher rate than the national average. It was also interesting to come across the research I did about the healthcare system. Interestingly enough, only about 43% of people that admit that they're suicidal will see a doctor or are helped to see a doctor. However, only 19% of that will actually see a mental health provider or a psychiatrist or somebody that they can provide specific help to help their brain. Utah and along the Wasatch Front, or the Rocky Mountain states, are more so known for their home remedies. And these are really increasing with oils, with different naturopathy, all different kinds of doctors, which are great in certain cases. But when somebody is struggling with a mental illness, they need specific help. And most people are not getting that help. And we can attain that to why the suicide rates are so high. Because there were a lot of cases where people were seeing physicians. They just weren't seeing the right physician. They weren't getting mental help that they really needed specific to them. There wasn't a plan in place of what they would do the next time they felt suicidal, or how to control those thoughts, or what to do when those thoughts came in. There were just prescriptions assigned to them that many times made their chemical imbalance even worse and led to a suicide almost no matter what. If we can get them the direct help that they need, it shows that the suicide rate decreases immensely. But if we don't, they're going to be way more susceptible, because things that we could be doing, such as home remedies or ignoring the fact that mental illness is an actual thing, is incredibly harmful to these people. Lastly, there's a culture in Utah that everybody talks about: religion. Utah is one of the most religious states in the United States, specifically for the LDS religion, but also different Christian religions altogether. It's found in most studies, or in all studies, it was found that if somebody was religious, they were less likely to commit suicide because they felt like they had a purpose. They felt like they had a greater knowledge of who they were and a better understanding. But there are also that thing of disappointment. Many Christian religions, you have to go through some kind of confession or repentance process that makes you really have to think about what you did. And if they're already susceptible to a mental illness, that feeling of hopelessness or loneliness or disappointment can add to those risk factors that make somebody more suicidal. This is most strongly pointed out in the same-sex attraction members. It's amazing how much that increase totally flip-flops. If they consider themselves to be part of the LGBTQ community and they are religious, no matter what religion they are, their chance of committing suicide almost doubles. Just because they don't know how to talk about their feelings or what they're feeling, or they're too afraid to talk about it because of the stigma that goes around with being Christian and same-sex attraction. Not that that is something that we have imposed on them, but something that either they have felt or they've heard, or just a fear. And again, sometimes that mental illness does play a factor, even if they have it in just the slightest way. In conclusion, I found that the best thing that we can do is create safe space for those that are struggling with suicide.